Hi, friends. Host Eric here. I was talking with those people. Got a pretty good night's sleep last night. Rachel just got up too. And my message this morning on this live stream is I'm not afraid of crazy. What I mean by that is one thing that, hi, Ron Allen Sloan, you are always first. You are the fastest one. One thing I encountered a lot of when I first started doing YouTube was a lot of people saying, Eric, you can't just put all your contact information out there like that. You're crazy. You're gonna have crazy people come to your house. And, it's well established that I've got at least a couple of stalkers or something that hang around the channel and are maybe kind of obsessed with me or something in not a healthy way. The names that come to mind immediately are Ashy Deep and Queen's Gambit, right? But I've also had before in the mix like Brittany, who had a legitimate mental illness, and other difficult people in the past, but a lot of times people will say to me when I'm dealing with somebody difficult, especially before, when I had less personal experience with mental health stuff, but that Eric, I think that person has something wrong with them, or they're not mentally well or whatever. Yeah, and so in fact, and indeed, somebody did come to my house uninvited and show up at my door one time in Laverne. Brittany did, and the way she got my address was, I wrote it on the return address label on the thing I sent to her. So I operate under the assumption that people are going to behave normally. I don't assume that I need to take precautions to prevent people from coming to my house. I've never been that popular, This is not a typing system. What Queen's Gambit is doing is, well, that's what I'm saying. It's like, I don't mind sort of going after C.S. Joseph and DSP, because C.S. Joseph may have some kind of, Brittany Hancock, actually. She did come bring a present, Paisley's microphone. I hope she's well also. I wasn't that upset about her showing up uninvited. She actually showed up uninvited twice. Despite the fact that after the first time I told her, do not do this again. The second time she showed up uninvited, she was with Spacey though, so I gave her a pass on it. I hope she's well also. She was a registered nurse who had what I would call an ontological collapse.
It's weird. Not to get too off topic, but I don't see ESFPs as being nurses.
She was definitely a registered nurse.
Wow.
She was a real, for sure, not bullshit registered nurse. She had a really nice, she had a nice car. She had, she was clearly, and also occasionally when medical subject would come up, she was actually quite knowledgeable about it. For example, do you know what that little line on the bottom of a penis is called?
Yes,
because of Brittany.
Yes.
It's called the seam of life.
Now I know who.
Brittany taught me that. Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. No. Winston's mom. Oh, drunk tar? That's possible. But what I'm saying is I don't want to beat up particularly on Queen's Gambit because I don't think he's he's a nasty, spiteful little guy, but he's not. You can't be scared of what you are. I'm not crazy. When I talk about crazy specifically, I mean YouTube stalker crazy. Like, ESFP and INFPs are both rather ill-equipped to supervise anybody. ESFPs can't supervise anybody because they have no good judgment. But INFPs can't supervise anybody because they don't know how to kick ass and take names enough. You know, they can supervise me. I'm really easy to supervise. Rachel and I are constantly supervising each other without trying.
Did they go into the thing?
I don't know. I haven't looked. I was out last night, man.
He's definitely shedding.
Yeah, I think he's molting.
I see. Yeah, molting. Yeah.
And so he's gonna be kind of tucked up in there for a couple of days until after he molts and eats his old shell, which is really gross.
You could see.
He eats his old shell. Yeah.
He's all like a pale, like white color. It's really fascinating.
Cool.
Hi, Pee-Pee. We can't go on without talking about the greatest kitty in the world, the kitty pageant winner.
Well, I may be crazy in some various ways. I mean, I've always been a fan of Clarence Thomas because, since he was the dissenting vote and the lone voice of reason on the federal case on marijuana that involved somebody named Angel something. He was the lone sane voice of reason when he said, if the federal government has purview over marijuana grown in someone's backyard and harvested and consumed for their own personal use on the grounds that their growing of marijuana influences interstate commerce, then literally everything is interstate commerce. Interstate commerce includes selling a pie at a church bake sale. How do you recover from ontological collapse when you are removed from language? It's an interesting question, Evelyn. And I think the same answer is, how do you quit drinking when you are married to language? You have to give up your ways. In some sense, it's probably easier for an ESFP to give up their ways. Same thing with the marijuana, Skygear. The case was the federal government had busted somebody for growing pot in their backyard for their own consumption. And got challenged appropriately on grounds of the federal government has no fucking jurisdiction to do this. And what the Supreme Court made it one of the worst Supreme Court rulings in history. Expanding the scope of interstate commerce beyond anything any sane person could ever dream of as being reasonable. And only Clarence Thomas was the one who voiced that obvious fact. I don't care about the issue, right? Even though it's marijuana, I don't care about it. If the Supreme Court were correct, I bet she's not even nitpicky, Jebediah's Emporium. I bet what she is aware. And you're aware, subtly, that she's aware. And you really wish you weren't. Listen, Mom, are you trying to bait me with your evolution shit? Do INFJs lack self-care? Yeah. Pretty much. I mean, but they have enough of it. It's their pond. Remember I said before, I don't know if you heard it before, but I said at some point, maybe you were here, maybe you weren't, when I said, your eighth spot is like your pond. You know, your dominant's like an ocean. You got infinite fish in there, and you don't care if other people fish in there because there's plenty of fish. But your eighth spot is like a pond. You've only got like 8 fish, and they breed slowly.
Yeah.
So like by the time, you got to eat out of that pond. So nobody fuck with my pond. Like, in other words, if you're 8th slot SI, you don't like other people interfering with your SI at all. If you're 8th slot SE like me, you cannot fucking stand anybody using any kind of leverage or threat or moving or taking action before talking about shit's done. If you want to make me an enemy, successfully leverage me into doing something I don't want to do. Because the thing is, my position on it is, if what you want to do is correct, you will always be able to talk me into doing it. Now there's Ron Allen Salon. Fucking moderator status is such a pain in the ass. Maybe just don't take it away from Isaiah.
Now everyone's a moderator.
Isaiah doesn't need it. There. Isaiah will be fine without being a moderator. He never does anything anyway with his moderation powers. I just made him a moderator because he works with me. But I didn't need to moderate. Eric, I think you mentioned 5th slot requires outside resources. Can you explain better? Well, sure. Well, let me explain with NE and NI, since that's the one I have most familiarity with. Extroverted intuition autopilots NI, which means that I unconsciously recognize the identity of things so that I can make jokes about them, deviate from them creatively, come up with better ways of saying it or whatever, you know? So, but if there's not any NI around, there's not much for me to NE off of. Now, NE is a pretty flexible function. I can NE off of SE, I can NE off of NI, and I can NE off of SI. Maybe that's because it's dominant. I don't know. Concurrently, Rachel has NI as a dominant function. It's easier to understand why it requires outside resources when you have a receive function. She's catching. She watches something, and she's listening to it and watching it. She's in her native state of being. She's receiving information. She's observing. She's an observer. Knowledge types are the most agential of all the types. In some sense, they're least married to action as a form of being. Do you know your attachment style in relationships? For example, I'm detached. I'm not sure about attachment style, but I would say that, you know, typically people have either a healthy attachment style or an unhealthy attachment style. And there's multiple kinds of unhealthy attachment styles and only one kind of healthy attachment style.
Wow, isn't that pretty crazy?
I guess I never thought about it before, but it would seem to me they should be, at least for perceivers. Okay, now no. What you say there should be true for other perceivers. So Rachel should be able to receive any, should be able to receive SE, and she should be able to receive SI. But I mean, I don't know. If it's symmetrical, that would be the case. I would not try to stretch it to the judges, though. I think judges really fundamentally work differently than perceivers. Are slots brain functions or learned or emotion? Slots are just habits of prioritization. They're habits of prioritization. Since I habitually prioritize extroverted intuition as a frame of reference, it's my dominant function. It's my first slot. It defines who I am, basically. Fold a blanket in a corner and leave 5 books there, just in case a strong wind comes up that would otherwise blow the blanket away. You know what a good NE test question I think is? I've asked it a few people lately. How many different punchlines can you think of for why did the chicken cross the road?
To get to his mate.
Get to his mate. I think a good one is because Elon Musk hadn't finished the tunnel yet.
There you go. That is a good one.
Or because they needed a fourth chicken to screw in the light bulb across the street. I don't know. I could think of a lot of punchlines. I'm trying to think of good ones. It's kind of challenging, you know. The best one I've come up with is because Elon Musk hadn't finished the tunnel yet. I like woke up and thought that joke this morning. I don't know why.
Oh, I'm so glad you're able to share it. I just want to FYI before anything is said, I like took a bunch of like clothes that had holes and like were not, and I threw them out. So if your dad asks, it's because they had holes and totally like not wearable.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I don't think. I'll ask. I don't think he'll say anything. Cognitive functions just end up being a system of dichotomies. I mean, I disagree. I mean, I agree, but it's not. The thing is, there are two kinds of dichotomies. There are those that are binary, and there are those that are proportional or inversely proportional, right? Or some other relationship like that. So I could say there are two kinds of people in the world: those who like cheese and those who don't. Okay, well, that's a bad dichotomy because, well, there may be a the point is, it is the case that if I talk a lot, that more time during the day is going to be spent talking then, you know, if you were to measure everybody in the country and say, I'm getting so how can I get a type session? I'm so lost. Oh, you just call me or call Rachel or email me, text me. My email address is my name backwards at gmail.com. That's ssuartscire at gmail.com because Eric Strauss at gmail.com was taken. And I didn't want to be Eric Strauss too. Hi, Amanda May. I'll always remember you as that lady with the good idea. The thing is, you could say, Sky Gear, that all of intelligent thought is just a bunch of dichotomies. You know, all Sky is just a bunch of dichotomies. The thing is, if you are describing a physics that possesses the identity of the two elements of it, possess a relationship that precludes some sort of exclusivity, then you're no longer just whistling Dixie. Validity and truth, and true and false, and valid versus invalid are not even remotely similar. You've got to be fucking kidding me. So similar. Pretty similar. They're not similar at all. True versus false is a temporary TI status. Valid versus invalid is a structural TI distinction. I spent so much time talking today to a TI polar too. She needed help on a few things. Every time I tried to pull up one ideational root, if you will, others came up right with it. And well, you know, the thing is this, Amanda May, here's how that whole thing played out. So yeah, and then if you want to play mix them together, you get soundness. So technically, there's truth, validity, and soundness. Soundness is something that's both valid and true. But since true's a argumentational status, it's a silly distinction to make, really. So Genexio put a video. I'll watch it. Hey, I don't know if you guys remember the other day, but somebody put a link to a Cypress Hill song, I think, and I clicked it and it played for like 30 seconds. I did get content notified on that. Oh, I forgot about this great ENTP quote by George Carlin. Listen to George Carlin's quote. It's such an ENTP quote. As a kid, I'd go to the movies and root for the criminals against the cops. And I still do. I love the crooks. I don't give a shit if they come to my house and kill my entire family. I'm on their side. What a ridiculous thing to say. What an absolutely ridiculous thing to say. This is why I didn't like George. I've grown to appreciate George Carlin because basically I've read more about him, and apparently he was an incredibly nice guy. He was like, everybody he met loved him, and he was super kind to everybody. You know, that's the thing. You wouldn't expect for somebody who says something like this. As a kid, I'd go to movies and root for the criminals against the cops, and I still do. I love the crooks. I don't give a shit if they come to my house and kill my entire family and I'm on their side. You would not expect that guy to be a nice guy. Apparently, he was an incredibly kind, nice guy, and always made sure to sort of celebrate the reality that people would often come up to him and ask him for his autograph and stuff. He always made a point of taking time to schmooze with each of them. And his explanation was, takes me 30 seconds or a minute to schmooze with these people, and I've got a fan for life. Contrast this with the ENFP quote. ENFP quote is something like, I don't care what people think about me. Never did, never will. Life is too short to be worrying about that shit. That's ENFP quote. George Carlin worries what people think about him. A lot. You know? And it makes him into a nice person as a consequence. No, George Carlin is a textbook ENTP. Nice in real life and asshole in front of the cameras, right? ENFPs are the opposite.
Yeah, that's why Ellen got her.
Nice in front of the cameras and asshole off the cameras.
But Ellen got caught.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, George Carlin had, as Amanda May says here, bullshit X-ray vision. I also have bullshit X-ray vision. And you've heard it from me too. Periodically, I get frustrated and start ranting about shit. Do you agree with the? Oh, right. I thought you were asking, do I agree with George Carlin's sentiment on police? No, I do not. I am not anti-cop in that fashion. I used to be, but I guess since the whole BLM movement, I no longer feel like it's a problem. I think it's basically gotten solved. So, and the thing is, even when I was anti-cop, I did my best to remember. Don't be a groupist, Eric. Police are people too. They're individual human beings.
Paper towels?
And I gotta say this too. When you need the police's help, as I did on a couple occasions in the last year, what did I do with the paper towels? Oh, they're there.
Thank you.
And they do a good job. You really appreciate it. The Arcadia police did a fantastic job of dealing with a very difficult person in a psychotic episode. Somebody who matters a lot to me. I've had another occasion where I had my car stolen, and the cops got it back for me in 15 minutes. It was amazing. Even they were amazed. Of course, I should mention that the cops reassured me at the time. I guess because they thought that this would make me feel better, that they had roughed up the guy some. So I was like, okay, cool. Whatever you got to do. Yeah, I didn't care because the guy stole my car. Can you type a 60-year-old INTJ? I don't think it's possible to type people quite at day 6. Okay? I think they have to be at least 1 week old.
What a.
Yeah, I could do that. To George Morris. That's kind of a good question. Hi, Lijo. Nice to see you. You're so famous. This is the video in question. Yes, I will evaluate that. Let's see. That sounds interesting. Yeah, that sounds like the sort of project I want to be assigned. It sounds to me like your objection is probably right.
Hey everyone. Today I'm going to tell you about a paradox in moral philosophy called the repugnant conclusion. So first, a question. Which of these two possible worlds do you think is better? First, a world with 1 billion people, all of whom are really fulfilled and happy. Or a world with billions and billions of people who are very unhappy, almost unhappy enough that they wish they didn't exist, but not quite. So they're leading lives that are just barely worth living, but no more. Personally, it seems obvious that the first world is preferable. But let me lead you through a little argument to the contrary. First, take a world with 1 billion extremely happy people. Call that world A. Now imagine world B, which has that same population of 1 billion extremely happy people, but also has a population of 1 billion moderately happy people. Is that better or worse? Well, it's not obvious it's better, but it's hard to see how it could be worse, right? Having additional people whose lives are living, how is that worse? Now imagine world C, which also has two populations of 1 billion, but the first is slightly less happy than their counterparts in world B, and the second is significantly more happy than their counterparts in world B. So overall, 2 billion people in world C, everyone's pretty happy, and the total happiness and average happiness are both higher in world C than in world B. It seems hard to argue with the idea that world C is better than world B, right? Total happiness, average happiness are both higher here. So by the law of transitivity, world C must be better than world A. We made two transformations. The first.
Okay. So what I want to explain first that is very useful is that the first thing anybody should do when evaluating that is say her paradigm is compare worlds. Okay. Now, compare worlds is a paradigm under which one might argue a given point. She's trying to argue a normative point under a compare worlds paradigm, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is she's assigning a normative status to a status quo. Whereas, unfortunately, normative statuses are only afforded to prospective or completed actions. So it's a category error. You know, the world that she's comparing is not good or bad. What you would have to argue is that the world is an impact of a prescribed action. And if that action produces world A, then and the other action produces world B, and world A is better than world B, then you prefer to take action A to create world A. Without the prospective action, in other words, because she's not advocating doing anything or changing anything, the thing she's talking about has no actual normative status at all. It's just in a hypothetical world. It's not good or bad. It is. Actions that people take are good or bad. I'll make a response video to this. I saw a video lately where they said that one's personality is not constantly changing over time, so why does that not hold for one's MBTI type? Well, the thing is, the personality is defined as those aspects of the self that are unchanging over time. So there's just about everything that's not a process prioritization. Everything that's not a process prioritization, we can think of it changing, right? Like I used to believe certain things. I now believe different things. Okay. I'll get back to your question in a second. Greetings, wisdom. But if you watch the video of me at 17, you can see clearly, long before I ever understood anything about type of personality or cognitive functions, ever heard of it at all, I was the same guy. There's no possible way that I'm self-fulfilling that prophecy, right? The other thing you know is, and what everybody knows, is that the people around you well, let's think about it this way. Let's say your wife or husband or son or daughter or brother or sister, somebody who's in close family with you, okay, were to communicate with you over the course of a few days via text or email. You would know for sure if it were a different person, if it were somebody faking to be them, unless the person were extremely good at faking, right? Personality is not changing because my dad might react like what. Let's say I suggest to my dad that we do an activity of some sort. On any given instance, he might say no or yes. But what will definitely always happen is that he'll kind of grimace first and be thrown into a thought process that basically goes, shit, this is disruptive of my TE plan and TE frame of reference. It wasn't on my SI list of anticipated things. It's disruptive of my expectations fundamentally. And I don't like that. When we mistype people, when we go wrong, we conclude that because that's implicit to him, he's going to be a person who never listens to other people's ideas. Well, that's not true. He's going to be a person who always has great ideas himself. Well, that's not true. He's going to be a person who some type description things are pretty true. He's going to be a person who likes to do the same things a lot. Now, you might say, well, how do you define do the same things a lot? Well, and that's what is critically important to remember. When we're talking about personality, we cannot talk about it while excluding the unit of time. In any given day, a person has a certain finite number of waking hours. And when we're talking about things like strength or weakness, what we're really talking about is total amount of time spent attending in certain fashions and not others. Since there are a finite number of hours in the day, It's very important to try as best we can not to reduce cognitive functions to attributes, but to keep them as processes, which is what they are. When we treat them as attributes, that's where we get confused. So, does my dad like to do the same thing a lot? Well, yeah, absolutely. He's got, but not always exactly the same thing. So, for example, he's got one primary vacation destination that he still goes to, and that's Palm Desert. He likes to go to places he's been to before.
It's true. He's very upset about Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. He's upset about Hawaii because Hawaii has ridiculous COVID restrictions that make it meaningless to try to visit there right now. He wants to go to Hawaii again. He
goes to the gym every day.
Goes to the gym most days, yeah. However, sometimes he deviates from this. So the last vacation he went to Laughlin. Laughlin is also someplace we used to go a lot, but he hasn't been there in a long time. So is he doing the same thing as he always does? Or is he, the point is, when he thinks about possible places to visit, he thinks about possible places he's been to before. And yet, occasionally, obviously, through his life, he'd visit new places. Otherwise, he wouldn't have accumulated this long list of places that he goes to, right? So my dad likes to go to the same place over and over again. Okay, well then, ESTJ must correlate with people who haven't gone to many places. Incorrect as a type description, right? My dad's been every fucking place.
Yeah.
But he is nevertheless a creature of habit. And I mean, and he's such a TE dom that my mom started grinding her teeth. Anybody but an ESTJ would have gone, well, it's another phase in the degradation of her identity called dementia. And that's just what it is. It's another phase. And it's just, she's going to start having it. My dad jumped gleefully, joyfully at this. Why? Is it because he's really so worried about my mom and her teeth? No. It's because if he's not solving some problem, he's at a loss. And this was a great problem for him to solve. He had to contact medical transport to come pick her up. He had to touch bases with me and Cameron. We went to meet the transport thing at the sunrise yesterday morning. We drove down to the dentist office with the behind the van that she was in, and actually we were in front of it, but whatever. That's TI tool for you. I just cannot tell a lie, right? That's kind of like the Abe Lincoln thing. Well, this is the thing, is I heard this thing before when visiting her, and Rachel was there too. Would you agree, Rachel, that when my mom's teeth grinding did not seem to go along with any pain? She was giving me no indication of pain. She was getting no indications of pain at all. And pain is something she can definitely still convey.
Mm-hmm. It was like stimming stuff. It really just felt like, that
would make him furious.
She's unable to communicate some things, so I
think she's stemming on the noise. My NI is clear on this. Maybe the feeling, but my NI is clear on this. She's stemming. I worked in special ed for a number of years, and autistic kids in particular, they do what's called stemming, which is it's short for self-stimulation. They do like this stuff. To a certain extent, all people stem. Like, I don't really do it anymore, but maybe occasionally still, but all the way well into adulthood, I periodically go like this with my eyes and make something go. I can see it, now I can't see it. Now I can see it, now I can't see it. Like that kind of shit, That's stemming. It's STIMM. ing actually. It's short for stimulation. Stimming. And I've long said someday I'd like to buy a racehorse and name it Stimming on the Lights. I think it's a great name for a racehorse.
Would you like some coffee?
I have a little bit left, but did you make a new pot?
Yeah.
If you could refresh me, that'd be great. A friend of yours smells his own beard all day long? I have some smell stems.
Is biting nails?
Yeah, it's a stem. Like I like to get the oil from over here and smell it. The oil's from behind my ear.
I used to be like that was my belly button.
That's one of those gross things you don't normally tell people. Well, in the late afternoon races, in like the 8th and 9th race in California anyway, it often starts to get dark and they turn on the lights. So they also have night racing. They used to have night racing in Hollywood Park. So I was envisioning the horse running down the stretch and the lights being on. Hollywood Park no longer exists as a racetrack, and Santa Anita doesn't do night racing. But Hollywood Park used to have a cool Friday night racing where they'd have like dollar bidders and stuff like that. At Los Alamitos, quarter horses, they have night racing too. So that's what I was thinking. But you can also envision people taking snaps, like flashes.
Definitely. That totally goes with horse racing. I've noticed that we go through this a lot less quickly than with the cheaper kind.
I agree with you. We'll get that from now on.
Yeah.
No, usually the best horses only run in the day. That's true. But I don't know. I just like the name. If you envision it as stemming,
Squirrel, what trouble are you causing?
and this is the other form. This is the other word, the other meaning of stemming. If you envision it as stemming from flash bulbs, then it works fine. Because in the Kentucky Derby or something, if your horse wins the Kentucky Derby, it's going to get lots of flash bulbs, right?
Hi, Pee-Pee. You hear the squirrel?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, me too.
Yes. Thank you for referencing that, Isaiah. What I just did was what Isaiah references as Joe Welling doing in the story A Man of Ideas. So I often talk about the story A Man of Ideas as being the quintessential story about an ENTP. And he's very excited, of course. He's very excited to tell everybody something. Of course he is. And he runs into town and he says, Rich has got 2 hands full and one. Oh, I'll get it, baby. I got it.
Oh, next time? Yeah. That's the base that I was getting at. I was like, wait, I put one of the base things down.
Anyway, Joe Welling rushes into town and he says, "It's been raining up in Monterey County. I can tell you, I know this, but not a cloud in the sky. I was over there. I saw the river rising and I knew it. How could I know? Not a cloud in the sky. Wait, hold on. I'm not going to lie. There were 2 clouds far in the east, but they were small clouds." It has to be precise, right? Just like I said, telling a story about going to the dentist with my... It's a short story. It's a very short story. Very much worth reading. Here, I'll tell you what. Here we go. It's short enough that I'll just read it to you. Oh, I don't want Spark Notes. I want the actual text of it. Who would want Spark Notes for A Man of Ideas? It's so short and easy to understand. All right, kids, it's story time. I do my best librarian story reader.
I mean, the worst library attender needs to go outside.
Okay. He lived with his mother, a gray, silent woman with a peculiar, ashy complexion. The house in which they lived stood in a little grove of trees beyond where the main street of Winesburg crossed Wine Creek. His name was Joe Welling, and his father had been a man of some dignity in the community, a lawyer, and a member of the state legislature at Columbus. Joe himself was small of body, and in his character, unlike anyone else in town. He was like a tiny little volcano that lies silent for days and then suddenly spouts fire. No, he wasn't like that. He was like a man who is subject to fits, one who walks among his fellow men, inspiring fear because a fit may come upon them suddenly and blow him away into a strange, uncanny physical state in which his eyes roll and his legs and arms jerk. He was like that, only that the visitation that descended upon Joe Welling was a mental and not a physical thing. He was beset by ideas, and in the throes of one of his ideas was uncontrollable. Words rolled and tumbled from his mouth. A peculiar smile came upon his lips. The edges of his teeth that were tipped with gold glistened in the light. Pouncing upon a bystander, he began to talk. For the bystander, there was no escape. The excited man breathed into his face, peered into his eyes, pounded upon his chest with a shaking forefinger, and demanded compelled attention. In those days, the Standard Oil Company did not deliver oil to the consumer in big wagons and motor trucks as it does today, but delivered instead to retail grocers, hardware stores, and the like. Joe was the Standard Oil agent in Winesburg and in several towns up and down the railroad that went through Winesburg. He collected bills, booked orders, and did other things. His father, the legislator, had secured the job for him. In and out of the stores of Winesburg went Joe Welling, silent, excessively polite, intent upon his business. Men watched him with eyes in which lurked amusement tempered by alarm. They were waiting for him to break forth, preparing to flee. Although the seizures that came upon him were harmless enough, they could not be laughed away. They were overwhelming. Astride an idea, Joe was overmastering. His personality became gigantic. It overrode the man to whom he talked, swept away all who stood within the sound of his voice. In Sylvester West's drugstore stood four men who were talking of horse racing. Wesley Moyer's stallion, Tony Tip, was to race at the June meeting at Tiffin, Ohio, and there was a rumor that he would meet the stiffest competition of his career. It was said that Pop Gears, the great racing driver, would himself be there. A doubt of the success of Tony Tip hung heavy in the air of Winesburg. Into the drugstore came Joe Welling, brushing the screen door violently aside. With a strange absorbed light in his eyes, he pounced upon Ed Thomas, who he knew Pop Greer's and whose opinion of Tony Tip's chances was worth considering. "The water is up in Wine Creek," cried Joe Welling with the air of Pheidippides bringing news of the victory of the Greeks in the struggle at Marathon. His finger beat a tattoo upon Ed Thomas's broad chest. "By Trenton Bridges is within 11.5 inches of the flooring," he went on, the words coming quickly and with a little whistling noise from between his teeth. An expression of helpless annoyance crept over the faces of the four. "I have my facts correct. Depend upon that. I went to Shinning's Hardware. I got a rule. Then I went back and measured. I could hardly believe my own eyes. It hadn't rained, you see, for 10 days. At first, I didn't know what to think. Thoughts rushed through my head. I thought of subterranean passages, springs, down under the ground, and went my mind delving about. I sat on the floor of the bridge and rubbed my head. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. Not one. Come out into the street and you'll see. There wasn't a cloud. There isn't a cloud now. Well, yes, there was a cloud. I don't want to keep anything back. There was a cloud in the west, down near the horizon, a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. Not that I think that has anything to do with it. There it is, you see. You understand how puzzled I was. And then an idea came to me. I laughed. You'll laugh, too. Of course. It rained in Medina County. That's interesting, eh? If we had no trains, no mails, no telegraph, we would know that it rained in Medina County. That's where Wine Creek comes from. Everyone knows that. Little old Wine Creek brought us the news. That's interesting. I laughed. I thought I'd tell you. It's interesting, eh? Joe Welling turned and went out at the door. Taking a book from his pocket, he stopped and ran a finger down one of the pages. Again, he was absorbed in his duties as agent of the Standard Oil Company. Hearn's Grocery will be getting low on coal oil. I'll see them, he muttered, hurrying along the street and bowing politely to the people right and left as he walked past. When George Willard went to work at the Winesburg Eagle, he was besieged by Joe Welling. Joe envied the boy. It seemed to him that he was meant by nature to be a reporter on a newspaper. "It is what I should be doing. There is no doubt of it," he declared, stopping George Willard on the sidewalk before Dowdy's feed store. His eyes began to glisten and his four fingers to tremble. "Of course, I make more money with a Standard Oil company, and I'm only telling you," he added. "I've got nothing against you, but I should have your place. I could do the work at odd moments. Here and there, I would run finding out things you'll never see." Becoming more excited, Joe Welling crowded the young reporter against the front of the feed store. He appeared to be lost in thought, rolling his eyes about and running a thin, nervous hand through his hair. A smile spread over his face and his gold teeth glittered. "You get out your notebook," he commanded. "You carry a little pad of paper in your pocket, don't you? I knew you did. Well, you set this down. I thought of it the other day. Let's take decay. What is decay? It's fire. It burns up wood and other things. You never thought of that? Of course not. This sidewalk here and this feed store, the trees down the street there, they're all on fire. They're burning up. Decay, you see, is always going on. It doesn't stop. Water and paint can't stop it. If a thing is iron, then what? It rusts, you see. That's fire too. The world is on fire. Start your pieces in the paper that way. Just say in big letters, the world is on fire. That will make them look up. They'll say, you're a smart one. I don't care. I don't envy you. I just snatched the idea out of the air. I would make a newspaper hum. You got to admit that. Turning quickly, Joe Welling walked rapidly away. When he had taken several steps, he stopped and looked back. I'm going to stick to you, he said. I'm going to make you a regular hammer. I should start a newspaper myself. That's what I should do. I'd be a marvel. Everybody knows that. When George Willard had been for a year on the Winesburg Eagle, 4 things happened to Joe Welling. His mother died. He came to live at the new Willard house. He became involved in a love affair, and he organized the Winesburg Baseball Club. Joe organized the baseball club because he wanted to be a coach, and in that position, he began to win the respect of his townsmen. He is a wonder, they declared after Joe's team had whipped the team from Medina County. He gets everybody working together. You just watch him. Upon the baseball field, Joe Welling stood by first base, his whole body quivering with excitement. In spite of themselves, all the players watched him closely. The opposing pitcher became confused. Now, shouted the excited man. Watch me, watch my fingers, watch my hands, watch my feet, watch my eyes. Let's work together here, watch me. In me, you see all the movements of the game. Work with me, watch me. With runners on the Winesburg team on bases, Joe Welling became as one inspired. Before they knew what had come over them, the base runners were watching the man, edging off the bases, advancing, retreating, held as by an invisible cord. The players of the opposing team also watched Joe. They were fascinated. For a moment they watched, and then, as though to break a spell that hung over them, they began hurling the ball wildly about, and amid a series of fierce animal-like cries from the coach, the runners of the Winesburg team scampered home. Joe Welling's love affair set the town of Winesburg on edge. When it began, everyone whispered and shook his head. When people tried to laugh, the laughter was forced and unnatural. Joe fell in love with Sarah King, a lean, sad-looking woman who lived with her father and brother in a brick house that stood opposite the gate leading to the Winesburg cemetery. The 2 Kings, Edward and the father, and Tom the son, were not popular in Winesburg. They were called proud and dangerous. They had come to Winesburg from someplace in the south and ran a cedar mill on the Trunnion Pike. Tom King was reported to have killed a man before he came to Winesburg. He was 27 years old and rode about town on a gray pony. Also, he had a long yellow mustache that drooped down over his teeth and always carried a heavy, wicked-looking walking stick in his hand. Once he killed a dog with a stick. The dog belonged to Win Ponzi, the shoe merchant, and stood on the sidewalk wagging his tail. Tom King killed it with one blow. He was arrested and paid a fine of $10. Old Edward King was small of stature, and when he passed people in the street, laughed a queer, unmirthful laugh. When he laughed, he scratched his left elbow with his right hand. The sleeve of his coat was almost worn through from the habit. As he walked along the street, looking nervously about and laughing, he seemed more dangerous than his silent, fierce-looking son. When Sarah King began walking out in the evening with Joe Welling, people shook their heads in alarm. She was tall and pale and had dark rings under her eyes. The couple looked ridiculous together. Under the trees, they walked and Joe talked. His passionate, eager protestations of love, heard coming out of the darkness by the cemetery wall or from the deep shadows of the trees on the hill that ran up to the fairgrounds from Waterworks Pond, were repeated in the stores. Men stood by the bar in the new Willard house laughing and talking of Joe's courtship. After the laughter came the silence. The Winesburg baseball team, under his management, was winning game after game, and the town had begun to respect him. Sensing a tragedy, they waited, laughing nervously. Late on a Saturday afternoon, the meeting between Joe Welling and the 2 Kings, the anticipation of which had set the town on edge, took place in Joe Welling's room in the new Willard house. George Willard was a witness to the meeting. It came about in this way. When the young reporter went to his room after the evening meal, he saw Tom King and his father sitting in the half-darkness in Joe's room. The son had the heavy walking stick in his hand and sat near the door. Old Edward King walked nervously about, scratching his left elbow with his right hand. The hallways were empty and silent. George Willard went to his own room and sat down at the desk. He tried to write, but his hand trembled so that he could not hold the pen. He also walked nervously up and down. Like the rest of the town of Winesburg, he was perplexed and knew not what to do. It was 7:30 and fast growing dark when Joe Welling came along the station platform toward the new Willard house. In his arms, he held a bundle of weeds and grasses. In spite of the terror that made his body shake, George Willard was amused at the sight of the small, spry figure holding the grasses and half running along the platform. Shaking with fright and anxiety, the young reporter lurked in the hallway outside the door of the room in which Joe Welling talked to the two Kings. There had been an oath, the nervous giggle of old Edward King, and then silence. Now the voice of Joe Welling, sharp and clear, broke forth. George Willard began to laugh. He understood. As he had swept all men before him, so now Joe Welling was carrying these two men in the room off their feet with a tidal wave of words. The listener in the hall walked up and down, lost in amazement. Inside the room, Joe Welling had paid no attention to the grumbled threat of Tom King. Absorbed in an idea, he closed the door and, lighting a lamp, spread the handful of weeds and grasses upon the floor. "I've got something here," he announced solemnly. "I was going to tell George Willard about it. Let him make a piece out of it for the paper. I'm glad you're here. I wish Sarah were here also. I've been going to come to your house to tell you all about some of my ideas here. They're interesting. Sarah wouldn't let me. She said we'd quarrel. That's foolish." Running up and down before the two perplexed men, Joe Welling began to explain. "Don't you make a mistake now," he cried. "This is something big." His voice was shrill with excitement. "You just follow me. You'll be interested. I know you will. Suppose this. Suppose all of the wheat, the corn, the oats, the peas, the potatoes were all by some miracle swept away. Now, here we are, you see, in this country. There's a high fence built all around us. Well, suppose that. No one can get over the fence, and all the fruits of the earth are destroyed. Nothing left but these wild things, these grasses. Would we be done for? I ask you that. Would we be done for?" Again, Tom King growled, and for a moment there was silence in the room. Then again, Joe plunged into the exposition of his idea. "Things would go hard for a time. I'd admit that. I've got to admit that. No getting around it. We'd be hard put. More than one fat stomach would cave in, but they couldn't down us. I should say not." Tom King laughed good-naturedly, and the shivering, nervous laugh of Edward King rang through the house. Joe Welling hurried on. "We'd begin, you see, to breed up new vegetables and fruits. Soon we'd regain all that we had lost. Mind, I don't say the new things would be the same as the old. They wouldn't. Maybe they'd be better, maybe not so good. That's interesting, eh? You can think about that. It starts your mind working now, doesn't it?" In the room, there was a silence, and again, old Edward King laughed nervously. "Say, I wish Sarah was here," cried Joe Welling. "Let's go to your house. I want to tell her of this." There was a scraping of chairs in the room. It was then that George Willard retreated to his own room. Leaning out the window, he saw George Welling going along the street with the two Kings. Tom King was forced to take extraordinarily long strides to keep pace with the little man. As he strode along, he leaned over, listening, absorbed, fascinated. Joe Welling again talked excitedly. "Take milkweed now," he cried. "A lot might be done with milkweed, eh? It's almost unbelievable. I want you to think about it. I want you to think about it. There would be a new vegetable kingdom, you see. It's interesting, eh? It's an idea. Wait till you see Sarah. She'll get the idea. She'll be interested. Sarah's always interested in ideas. You can't be too smart for Sarah. Now, can you? Of course you can't. You know that." Isn't that a great story? I love that story. I love that story. That is an ENTP. That is an ENTP. Hi, Moxie. I mean, there's one story that comprises a book called Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson. Winesburg, Ohio is one of my favorite books. I'm anime. I went a little faster than I would have gone for ideal reading speed because I'm live streaming and I didn't want to spend forever reading it, you know. If you really wanted to listen to it, you could. There exists such a type of person such that they're like this guy here. Yes. Okay. I agree. Well, Sky Gear, and that's a reality that NTPs need to understand, and I'm growing to understand slowly, and trying to apply. I'm going to apply it more in my videos. Is NTPs process language at real time, even if it's sped up. So I'm sure Sky Gear, you watch video. If I have an explanatory video and you watch it at all, you probably watch it at double time. And then concurrently, other people coming, man, that was dense. I had to watch that a couple times or watch it slowly or something. It's just a matter of how you like to get your information, what kind of information you like to get. So TI tool users like to get the kind of information that TI is particularly useful and appropriate for. And when we do, it's just like piggity, 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 pow. Is it possible for an INFJ to be in the Mafia? Yeah. There's also a Sherwood Anderson is really, really brilliant. I never think about that, but if asked the question now, I would say, if I can have another shot at the question that everybody always asks, like, you get to have dinner with somebody from the past, some historical figure. I pick Sherwood Anderson, actually. I pick Sherwood Anderson. Praxeology? No, I'm not familiar with it. Let me Google it. Well, they engage in both, obviously. So people engage in purposeful behavior, they engage in reflexive behavior, and they engage in observational behavior. Observational behavior is what you call agential. Purposeful behavior is what you'd call subjective, and reflexive is what you call objective. So when you as an entity are functioning as an agent, you are observing. When you are functioning as a subject, you are acting or interfacing with the world. And when you're functioning as an object, you are having reflexive responses to things. One of the nice things about cognitive functions is once I made this important distinction, that we have to understand a couple of things that make this complicated. One is that a function is either inherently agential, objective, or subjective. And in these meanings of the words, objective does not mean rational at all. Okay, it means a function either is meant to see the entity a function exists from a frame of reference in which the entity itself is an object. For example, Rachel's a receiving type. She's the object of some action. So anyway, functions inherently are aligned with agentialness, subjectiveness, or objectiveness, but it's also the case that slots align with that. So my first slot is agential in nature, which is to say my being, my ontology is going to be defined by my first slot function. Now, my first slot function is an action function. So to say that my agency is an action is to run afoul of the fact that my dominant function is not an agential function. So the key thing to note there is it actually is an agential function. Extroverted intuition in the dominant slot it treats extroverted intuition. I'm both an object of others' extroverted intuition, a subject of producing extroverted intuition, and an agent observing the extroverted intuition residue, leftovers, or the extroverted intuition of finalia of the world, of people moving through the world, So the thing is, when somebody extrovertedly intuits words that express claims, justifications, and such, TI is right at home. TINE especially is right at home. So in that sense, since that's the kind of stuff I usually talk about, if you're an INTP and you're watching my videos, you probably go time and a half or even 2 times because you're optimally designed to process exactly that kind of data. Extroverted intuition is about awareness of other people's future. No, it's not. That's insane. I've never heard anything so unconnected to extroverted intuition. I am not aware of other people's futures. How would that be the case? Why would that be the case? I believe myself as an agent. So look, here's the key thing to note. So my agency is storytelling, basically. And yet an agential function is that which observes. So I'm trying to observe reality by telling it what it is. I mean, I like that idea of praxeology building on the axiom that humans cannot not act, except it's wrong, right? The thing is, to correctly analyze human ontology, we have to do a few things before we can go any further. We have to talk about the fact that there are fields, there are objects on the fields, some of which are agents, and there are grammars to fields. FE and TE are subject object, and they're always paired with the agent function. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. FETE are that's how this all come together now, Sky Gear. It's starting to really come together. FETE are subject object, and that's why they always have to be paired with the agent function, the knowledge function, which is why I say that interface knowers are very different because they can't really operate without they can't isolate their dominant function from their tool very well. Whereas it's easy to understand how a perceiver can isolate their dominant from their tool. SI, very easy to understand how you isolate the dominant from the tool. SE, very easy to understand how you isolate the dominant from the tool. NI, much more challenging to understand. So well, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So agency is observation, but your own identity is also part of agency, right? So in other words, it's not just your observations about the world, but your observations about yourself. And so the thing is, maybe knowledge should be object only, possibly. But the point is that if it's conscious, this is the thing. If it's conscious and in the dominant slot, then you are willfully choosing to, willfully prioritizing readiness to receive, right? And so in that regard, it's both your ontology to be an observer and you're using your agency to observe, right? Because you see, agency is also the capacity to be different ways. If you don't have agency, like this doesn't have any agency, it doesn't have the capacity to be different ways. All right, so note when I say objectives, then, this is why this gets very complicated, is because of the linguistic matters. We use the word objective to mean different things. Typically, when we're using it, most people, the way they use it is this. They want to attack someone else's position by accusing that person of not being objective. When we use it like that, we're using it to mean an interested or a disinterested calculus. You're not using a disinterested calculus, so I can't trust what you're saying as being authentically directed towards the truth. In other words, if a coach complains about a bunch of calls in a game, we don't think that that's very good evidence there were a bunch of bad calls in a game. We think, well, that coach is being subjective. He's trying to influence the referees to get the outcome he wants, as he should, because his role there is to be subjective, to be the subject, right? The role of the referees is to be the agent and or object. So mostly it's the agent to observe and then subject to blow the whistle, right? Object when they get yelled at by the coach. Now, are the referees being objective? They're being objective when they're using a disinterested calculus as their means of expressing their agency. So they have an agential job fundamentally, observe and note occasions of things. But they are, because it's a knowledge, it's a receive thing that they're doing, it necessarily goes along with an interface function. So once they've decided that a foul's been committed, they blow the whistle, the guy has to go stand up there, and then so they tell them what you got 1 + 1, and then yada yada. So in the game, then, if we're using the words subjective and objective colloquially, we'd say the refs are the only objective people in the building. Everybody else is subjective. They're either a fan of one team, a member of a team, or a coach of a team. So let's agree on that simple definition of objective and subjective and put that aside now. I don't think anybody can dispute that this is the most common definition of objective and subjective is interested or disinterested calculus. When you say to somebody on the internet and you argue with them, you're being subjective. You're saying to them, your bias has caused you to affirm this position in the face of contrary evidence. Okay? Now, when we're talking about it in terms of something that can be simulated, objects are things that are on a field. Objects on a field may or may not have the capacity to vector, which is to say, move in some fashion, right? Like this is an object on the field that has no agency. It doesn't move on its own or do anything on its own. I'm an object on a field that has agency. I move on my own and do things on my own. We're both subject to some of the grammars of this field, and each subject to other grammars that the other is not subject to. I mean, the thing is, it is possible at least then to imagine that somebody's job be to be objective and that somebody could do that job more or less well. In other words, to use a disinterested calculus and to be fair. That's what judges are for, right? I may not like that team and I may not like the arguments they're making, but it's indisputable that they won the round, so I'm going to vote for them when I'm the judge of a debate round, for example. Now that we've talked about objective and subjective as they're commonly used, let's talk about how they most literally could be used, which is they simply mean of the subject of the object, which brings to mind immediately the fact that there needs to be a that's where the slot comes in, Skygear. So my point is that even though extroverted intuition is a subject function, that I can use it in a subjective fashion, in an objective fashion. In other words, I'm receptive to extroverted intuition, and I mean, put it this way, I can be impacted by it. I'm impacted by it. If somebody else, if you want to interface with me on extroverted intuition, no problem. We can riff back and forth off of each other, right? In that sense, I'm able to treat the I'm able to incorporate the subject-object style of interface with an action function that's subject in and of itself. But so in other words, to the extent that there's something like dimensionality, it stems from that. From which angle of being are you competent at a given function links to slot. Look, the point is this. Agency in general refers to the capacity to be differently across time. Or you could more simply say agency is will. Having, the capacity to have will. Or a being of will. A being of will is an agent. Now, maybe we should not use the word agent in that sense because it's confusing. Maybe we should say a person. A person makes up agent, subject, object. They observe, they act, they know. Right? They observe, they act, they are acted upon. Functions are strategies of observing, acting, or acting upon, or being acted upon. Observing, acting, or being acted upon. One strategy of acting is interfacing. I agree with you. So maybe that's not the best word to use for the agential third of the thing. You could call it the epistemological third of the thing, maybe. But see, that's misleading because it had nothing to do with Jung, Sten. Philosophy is much grander, much larger, vastly more vastly more accomplished than Jung ever touched the bottom of the iceberg of. Okay, so these matters of these are the linguists are the best philosophers, and there is just no disputing it. Linguists understand. Everybody else bumblefucks around. Rephrase your question, John W. That question doesn't make any sense. Oh, I see. When you're talking about functions specifically. Okay, yeah. We shouldn't refer to functions as objective or subjective except for TI and FI. TI is the objective deliberation function. FI is the subjective deliberation function, which is to say, and that's in the colloquial sense. Okay, TI is a disinterested calculus. FI is an interested calculus. And in that regard, Jung got it backwards. He called TI subjective. The reason he calls TI subjective is because TI people are stubborn and go with what they think, and they think they're smarter than you, and all that kind of shit, right? But the reason that TI is objective is not because the people are necessarily objective. It's because the process is one of objective data. Words are spoken that everybody can reference equally, and therefore draw equal conclusions about, and is backed up with an objective universal metric called validity, plus a wishy-washy usually metric called truth, or at least a tool called argument status assignment called truth. No, that's not right, Ron Allen Salon. TI doesn't make sense universally. So, all pigs oink. I oink. Therefore, I'm a pig. That makes no sense universally. One, it makes no sense universally because it's not true that all pigs oink. Number two, it's not true that I oink. And number three, it's not true that I'm a pig. It also doesn't make any sense universally because even if I did oink, it wouldn't establish that I'm a pig given the nature of what came before. Okay? The fact that even if all pigs do oink, my oinkage doesn't make me a pig because that would be invalid. And this is something that is universally true in the sense that if you're a bank in Guadalajara and you say, oh, we decided to interpret 100 as meaning 1,000. You point out that's not what 100 means, right? That would be using TI. TE would be, I got a good idea. I know how we can make a bunch of money. We just define 100 as 1,000. So now when we borrow $100 from them, they have to give us $1,000 or whatever, you know. Well, remember, TE, so-called inductive reason. Don't call it inductive reasoning. It's just induction. There's one reason. There's one reason for induction. Haven't seen any counterexamples. There's only one reason for induction. It's not reasoning. It's the alternative to reasoning. Yeah, only is a quantifier. All, no, and only are all quantifiers. As far as symbols, I don't know if there's a specific symbol for it or not. I'm sure there is. You can make up whatever symbol you want for all, no, and only. The thing is, the reason TI logic exists is because of the statement connectives. All of language is predicated around statement connectives. And, or, if then, and not. So, I mean, it is true that TE is not interested in the words particularly. They're not interested in who's right. They're interested in who's accomplished what they're set out to accomplish, or what are we trying to do here, you know? So here's one reason why people might think that TE is universal, whereas TI is not. A good TE thing for a company to do would be, we're going to sell a product and we want to make sure it's very, very easy for everyone to use so that it's very popular. Then they're going to hire somebody with very good TE to make it very easy to use for everybody. And because that's what the TE person's task is assigned as, the TE person will accomplish that goal. Now, the fact that the TE has made something more useful for everybody, whereas a TI argument that might say, but that makes it less robust, therefore weaker, therefore less good, would not, is why we have iPhones. Why do we have iPhones? Because TE people didn't listen to TI people. Now, you might conclude, therefore, TE is more universal. Well, yeah, if TE is more likely to attain the goal that it is set out to attain, if the goal it's set out to attain is make this popular with people, as popular as possible, not as good or correct as possible, then you're correct. But that's not reasoning. That's winning, you know? I don't know what else to call it. Okay, so Rain says, Eric, you mean to talk about the way meanings and communications work, saying that cadence and speed don't matter for interpreted meaning? No, I didn't. I never said that. Cadence and speed very much matter for interpreted meaning. Absolutely. Why would I ever say that? But really, you're only making a comment about the architecture of English and a bunch of other languages instead of about communication as a concept itself and its mechanisms. Well, I mean, most communication that is persistent, in fact, I think I would say all communication that's persistent in an objective form, that is, say, data everybody can access, is communication that's executed by a language. So, I mean, Rain, what I'm saying is the communication half of the world, which represents half of human experience, is subject to the laws of the communication half of the world. The experiential half of the world is not. Yeah, John W. The modern society has begun treating empirics like the filthiest of whores, and has caused me in general to reject utilitarian justifications by and large, to reject empirics as a good metric for most things that matter. And makes me want to share with you this bit of writing on the matter. So, back to the library we go. I'll share this document for everybody to see, since it's in Google Docs. Share. Anyone with a link can view. Copy link. And I'll put it right here. So I'm going to start here on page 4. Arguments and the frameworks they imply or represent. Implicit frames. An argument in a debate round, like any verbalized argument, carries with it the frame that can be inferred from the argument. For example, if I say we should exercise to keep our hearts healthy, one implicit frame, that is to say a set of facts that the statement presupposes are not in any dispute, is that maintaining heart health is good. The above statement uses numbers 3 and 6 from below as its implicit frame. Preventing harm is good. Once it's established that harm is prevented, its value is not questioned. That there are reasons linked to studies or data, or that such information is more reliable than personal experience in determining matters of one's own body, is another implicit frame. We can break down every argument as an example of one or more of these implicit frames or values. And you see they link to the cognitive functions. 1, singularity, that's NI. Preferability over alternatives is functionally the mechanism. 2, originality, that's extroverted intuition. And its underlying engine is high ceiling, potential for greater impacts than known approaches. Number 3 is harm prevention remediation. That links to FI, and it relates outcomes to intentions. Representationalism, 4, the extent to which things mirror the general mores and standards of a given population of arguers, is FE. 5, relative absolutism. This attains absolute status under certain conditions, is TI. Number 6, absolute relativism. We look to empirics for a more efficient course against outcomes compared against the status quo. And that's TE. 7, reliability. We know it's worked many times before and anticipate similar outcomes going forward. That's SI. And number 8, execution. We need to shake things up a bit or make the status quo uncomfortable by adding unpredictability. Poorly logicked against purpose, self-interest. So explanation, that's SE. Explanation. Explicit frames, like we have in debate. In competition debate, we have explicit frames where you say what your frame is. You don't just ignore that question. Like that lady who did that philosophy video, right? She ignored that question. I'm going to ignore a framing question entirely. Well, if you ignore framing questions, then you can just argue anything, right? explicit frames like we have in debate show the value, the importance of relative absolutism as the implicit value to debate. We set the status of something Z as status X for the purposes of debate Y, and thus needn't ever consider within the event of the debate whether something Z might actually have the status not X and G. This is so because such violates the implicit frame in which the discourse occurs, that of relative absolutism, in which a given claim carries with it the burden of its meanings and the implications thereof. The notion that a given course ought be pursued because, quote, now is the tipping point, or because Y is key to X, are arguments that presume singularity. The best linked story is the correct one, and conflicting linked stories are wrong. In reality, most impacts in complex systems can't be causally reduced, and so arguments like now is the tipping point or Y is key to X are bullshit. Representationalism is the notion that inclusion and equality are implicit goods, and thus runs afoul of other implicit frames frequently. It views claims not as matters to be legitimized via absolute relativism, but rather through linkage to empirics. The empirics themselves are attained within the implicit frame, however, and therefore don't link meaningfully to the claim for others operating under different implicit frames. So this is what causes, amongst normal people, big conflict between TE and TI people. TE people don't get this sentence. They don't understand this. The empirics themselves are attained within the TE user's implicit frame and therefore don't link meaningfully to the claim for others operating under different implicit frames. And that's what's wrong with absolute relativism. It fails to acknowledge that there can be relative absolutism. Originality manifests the implicit frame of preferring alternatives to that which has been done before. It makes arguments of inherency and underestimates the risks of untried approaches to things. This is NE. Arguments that display this implicit frame are rare in debate, but include, we ought not limit carbon emissions because solvency will arrive in some manner we don't anticipate. Carbon caps comprise a very poor workaround kind of solution, and because of the harms implicit to those, we ought wait until we have a better solution, which we can assume will come because of our extroverted intuition. And then lastly, reliability, the SI frame of reference, overweights potential harms from untried solutions. In other words, it says we should never try anything we haven't tried before because it might not go right. It favors that which is known to correlate over that which may potentially correlate with greater strength, but which will usually produce ancillary unintended outcomes. SI reliability is actually a good frame of reference to include in politics because it prevents too much radical change too quickly. That's why SI reliability frame of reference is implicit to the idea that courts should follow precedent instead of just making decisions independently of previous decisions. So there's some more explanation here, and I want to read about RA and AR. This is basically TE and TI. Relative absolutism, TE. Absolute relativism, relative absolutism, TI. Absolute relativism, TE. So relative absolutism means it's relative, but it's absolute. Under this frame, words are absolute in their expression, but relative in their meaning. So whenever someone says something, those words have precise meanings in that context. They're unchanging meanings, just as the weight of a 1 pound brick is unchanging. However, in another context, one might define the word differently and thus offer that this time the brick is 2 pounds. Once agreed upon, that's what it is for the duration of the exchange. The reality of the brick is just a status that's absolute within the frame reality, which itself is a brick to be defined for the purposes of making arguments about the relationship between bricks and reality. In other words, that's very hard to understand. We agree for the sake of argument to define Mia as apple. And then for the rest of the argument, nobody gets to say, yeah, but Mias aren't really apples. Because it's irrelevant. We've defined it as apple. We're trying to conditionally determine an answer. If it were an apple, what would the answer be? That's why we're talking out the arguments, because we're saying we don't know if it's an apple yet, but we have to consider the fact that it might be. So let's pretend for the sake of argument that it's an apple and see what happens conditionally. So we don't have to actually take any action based on the fact that it is an apple, because we're just arguing about what would happen if it were. Now, here's the alternative frame that conflicts all the time: absolute relativism. The meaning of something is absolute to the particular parties and is distinct from the definitional constraints of relative absolutism. Thus, people will often say things like, well, I know I said it that way, but I mean something else. Or, you just don't get what I mean. I'm just not expressing it well. This presumes that there is a meaning outside of a definition of a word. Relative absolutism says if you mean anything at all, you present that meaning statically so that others can glean the information you convey, scrutinize it, and determine statuses against other such statically presented words. Absolute relativism says, no, words are how I attempt to express meaning that authentically exists beyond words. It doesn't matter how relatively absolute your conclusion is because it's not absolutely relative to me or other people. So, debate impacting critique. The arguments we make here in competition debate produce tomorrow's common argumentational usage. There is a genuine trickle-down effect in the marketplace of ideas when ideas are genuinely good. The best arguments have multiple qualities. They are concise, NI. They appeal to a universal and unquestioned truth. They analogize soundly. They're logically valid. They resonate with people's authentic attachments. They display concern for the common welfare. They legitimize against a concrete, measurable effectiveness. In other words, they validate under all these frames of reference. The best arguments do. Logical validity is a necessary but insufficient burden, typically, while measurable effectiveness is often determinant in convincing the judge to vote for you. Lay judges will often vote with their authentic attachments, so most debaters explicitly display concern for welfare, at least in lay cases. A lay judge is somebody who's not a competition debater, but judging a debate round anyway for some reason. Rachel? Hey, Rachel, would you mind finding a shady spot or something? Because that's kind of loud.
Oh, sorry.
I don't mean to be so fussy like that.
No, you just sounded exactly like my brother.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't like your brother. That's not good. Okay, so debate historically has overweighted some of these virtues and underweighted others. A proper judging of a round, in fact, ignores some aspects of arguments entirely while affording others great significance. Logical validity, like I said, is a necessary but insufficient burden, while measurable effectiveness is often determinate. And lay judges sometimes will vote on their feelings or on what they think is best for everybody. The more lay the judge, the more necessary to rely on empirics because the absolute relativism of their judging metric implies a frame of empirics, particularist substantiation, is preferred reflexively. In other words, the more lay the judge, the more likely they are to use utilitarian argumentation. Actual harms in the real world are weighted more heavily than are threats to principles or to the integrity of a system's grammar because that's harder to understand. So it is that with lay judges appeals to conditionality-based decisions, that's not standing, which means this is unwarranted, so it falls too, are less likely to attain the correct result than are appeals to emotion likely to attain the wrong result. The resonance of an argument with an individual operating under an absolutely relative frame is to the actual experience of individuals, not to its legitimacy against other static word objects in the round. The debate community has within it to affirm the good as defined through the implicit value of adversarial rhetoric, namely our best practices, the subjecting of claims made to scrutiny and motivated attack such that bad ideas don't get affirmed into actual policy. This is why the AF has a burden. This is why we default to neg if AF fails to meet that burden. Human understanding grows cross-generationally, and this evolution reflects in our argumentation. Identity politics comprise the authentic rejection of an unjust status quo in the absence of widespread incorporation of a better way to attack that injustice. We see those argumentation blocks break apart now as the implications of their inconsistencies make them lose ever more rounds over time. The real source of injustice always gets away scot-free when the good guys chase down the wrong suspect. In this instance, as in every instance, injustice manifests because the ends have been used to justify the means. Thus, debate's future and duty is the annihilation of utilitarianism from serious conversation about public policy. We fulfill this duty along two lines of legitimization. Foremost, the ethical discussion always ends with the utilitarian side grasping to behave as a real normative framework. It can only give us the moral status of an act in hindsight. It might prescribe action according to the best estimate of an outcome, but that's the second problem. Those kind of predictions are absolutely relative. My prediction is legitimate only on my hopes and guesses unless I appeal to empirics, and that's where the evil creeps in. Predicting this or that change in law will save lives neglects to presume that vastly more vectors come into play that can be causally reduced in that fashion. It further avoids that those vectors produce outcomes measured in many different units, important to different people in different ways. To measure only those impacts you want is to render empirics meaningless in drawing conclusions about anything. Note, I wrote this before COVID. I wrote this before COVID. How prescient was that? How prescient was that? The alt of alts. So what do we do about all this? Well, the traditional impact calculus is that commonly employed in policy debate: probability, magnitude, and time frame. This calculus continues to be used in many rounds today. The appeal of it is that it affords the competitor a tighter frame in which to put together a case, and it gives the judge a common unit of measure upon which to decide the round. The primacy of this calculus in debate for a long time reflected an implicit frame which suggests that looking ahead by extrapolations is a good way to make decisions about what action should be taken now. This still resonates as true for many people, because for individuals acting as individuals in pursuit of their own interests, it is true. Individual agency expresses best when the proactive aspects of the self adhere to the conclusions of an interested calculus, while the constraining aspects of the self adhere to the conclusions of a disinterested calculus. In other words, because I love my brother more, it's okay that I save him first before going back for other kids trapped in the fire. But it's not okay to use another child to shield my brother from the fire, knowing the other child will be burned to death. The decision to act in support of one's interests is acceptable provided it violates none of the constraints that are affirmed by the disinterested calculus. I'll repeat that again. The decision to act in support of one's own interests is acceptable provided it violates none of the constraints that are affirmed by the disinterested calculus. In the public sphere, individuals carry out the will of the group, thus deferring their agential ownership somewhat. The group, however, does not have interests, and every proactive expression of interest is the expression of one or more of the individuals in the group. Cooperation between individuals in the governing group purportedly produces a hybrid policy that balances competing interests. However, no such policy should be affirmed unless it upholds against the constraints of disinterest first. Just as the risk of burn to one's brother doesn't justify the burning of another child, so too does the act of compromise between individuals pursuing their particularist interests fail to justify the abdication of each cooperating individual to adhere to the constraints that pass disinterested muster. I will read this sentence again because it's absolutely brilliant and absolutely completely true. Just as the risk of burn to one's brother does not justify the burning of another child, so too does the act of compromise between individuals pursuing their particularist agendas fail to justify the abdication of each cooperating individual to adhere the abdication of each doesn't justify the abdication of responsibility committed by each cooperating individual when he or she fails to adhere to constraints that pass disinterested muster. To the constraints required by a disinterested calculus. It's better. It's okay. It's not okay. It is not okay if the federal government sends aid to the president's hometown and not the more damaged and needy town because the president likes his hometown more. This continues to be true even if we point out all the good impacts done in the president's hometown, and we measure all the ways in which the other town doesn't really need it, and regardless of any metrics we present at all. It's wrong because it's driven by an interested calculus in a context where only a disinterested calculus is morally permitted. Thus, it is that to wisely determine public policy, we must negate the subjective and the interested in our consideration. Governance is foremost the custodial work of having a monopoly on the use of force. That a proposed application of that force be just ought be a necessary criterion for consideration and also insufficient for adoption. Empirically supported outcomes purportedly to be attained in the world of the affirmative after the advocacy becomes policy always manifest an interested subjective calculus. The process of utilizing such evidence begins at the conclusion sought to be attained, sustained, and works backwards to find supporting data. Empirical substantiation is inherently a subjective advocacy because objective analysis acknowledges the limits of prediction within a chaotic, complex, adaptive system. Empirical substantiation is the selling of a link story to justify something. If the action prescribed didn't need to justify some transgressive element, then it wouldn't need to rely upon empirics to outweigh the harms it necessarily creates in hopes of speculative benefits. The affirmation of any advocacy also affirms the implicit frame of the advocacy. Thus, if we affirm that which justifies means by appealing to ends, like COVID bullshit, we also affirm that manner of decision-making. Each of us has a duty to constrain ourselves against and according to universal limiting principles. In accordance with. The claim otherwise is the claim that sometimes it's okay to unjustly commit non-responsive violence against some people. Almost none of the debaters who advocate government force further purportedly just ends while ignoring that justice itself is a process critique would be comfortable actually doing the job of the legally empowered individual who sticks the gun in the non-transgressor's face and forces them into a cage. All the people who advocate for that. For those who advocate this bullshit, right? You wouldn't actually be comfortable doing the job of the legally empowered individual who sticks the gun in the non-transgressor's face and forces them into a cage. If you were experiencing it, you'd feel the injustice of your own behavior and be sickened by it. But until we as a community acknowledge that our reliance on empirics, predictions, and the balancing of interests necessarily produces the discursive environment in which such aggression manifests, we will continue to reinforce the bad reasoning that enables such transgressive governance to persist. But actually, a failure to reason is a form of reasoning, I guess. I don't like to even afford that word. It doesn't deserve it. But let's look at how this would actually play out in a case. So here's a nation K I wrote for an argument that said United States citizens should have to have mandatory national service. Violation, misusing nation. It's the reification of a non-agent. Use the word correctly. Voter. Because the case is predicated on the fallacious attribution of agency to a non-agent, the case can't be sustained once that fallacy has been identified and properly critiqued as per now. Impacts. Voting for my opponent reinforces the commission of political discourse via metaphor and the ongoing mistaking of the apparent implications therefrom as legitimate conclusions. Example. Let's say my opponent argues that he ought to win the round because he has more silent than I. Silence is golden, gold is heavy, and thus his arguments have more weight. In other words, I'll repeat that. Let's say my opponent argues, I ought to win this round because I have been more silent than my opponent. Silence is golden, gold is heavy, and thus my arguments have more weight. To buy this argument, we'd have to ignore that words have meaningful limits. Gold and silence doesn't have physical weight. Its weight is a metaphor. Nations don't take international action. Only individuals act. Nation is a rhetorical tool used in advocacy to justify actions taken by individuals. Thus, my opponent's case is built of metaphorical fool's gold and is as light as helium. If the opponent says, but you used metaphor in impacting your K turn, double turn. I'm using metaphor in impacting the flow. That's not the same as political discourse. Metaphor is appropriate in impacting the entirely metaphysical environment of the debate flow, while it is not when impacting matters of public policy. The outcomes of this discursive environment are zero-sum and don't impact society. post-fiat outcomes do, as they represent public policy advocacies. The manner by which both kinds of outcomes are attained is the drawing of distinction. The fact that my opponent conflates the two both sets off this double turn and exemplifies the risk of metaphorical reasoning in policy advocacy. My opponent, in theory, could win the round on the gold is heavy argument. At least I'd have to answer it, and it wouldn't lose my opponent the argument. It wouldn't lose my opponent the round, unlike their current mistake, because this double turn drives a stake through the heart of their AF case in hopes of winning. The core message here is that the affirmative has misascribed to the nation a status as a moral actor and thus failed to affirm this resolution. Argument 1. In affirming, they're making a normative claim because the resolution says ought to, and our definition of normative is consistent with the claim made by the resolution. Definition of illocutionary, relating to or being the communicative effect, such as commanding or requesting of an utterance. Argument 2. The normative claims regarding the state of the nation are not claims regarding an object that is subject to that sort of locutionary analysis. Brubaker, 2004. Because nationality is an ontological claim, either self-identified or self-imposed, it's not possible to speak meaningfully of a nation without establishing the individual to whom that status is being conferred. Nationhood is not an ethno-demographic or ethno-cultural fact. It is a political claim. It is a claim on people's loyalty, on their attention, on their solidarity. If we understand nationhood not as a fact but as a claim, then we can see that nation is not a purely analytical category. It is not used to describe a world that exists independently of the language used to describe it. It is used rather to change the world, to change the way people see themselves, to mobilize loyalties, kindle energies, and articulate demands. Tag Brubaker B. The AF speaks of a nation as though it were a group or community that exists. Instead, a nation is a claim upon individuals. Their failure to make the distinction renders it impossible for them to affirm. How does the category nation work? Putting the question this way displaces our everyday understanding of nations as collectives, entities, communities. It suggests that we should start instead by considering nation as a category, a term, and nationalism as a particular language, a political idiom, a way of using that word or category. Argument 3. If we accept the AF's assumption that the nation is an object of analysis, we are left with an amorphous and undefined thing around which no meaningful work can be done. We might say that nation is, in the first instance, a category of practice, not a category of analysis. I want to make the category nation the object of analysis rather than use it as a tool of analysis. I ask not what is a nation, but how does a nation work as a category of practice, as political idiom or claim? What does it mean to speak in the name of a nation, and how should one assess the practice of doing so? Is this a practice that can be defended and that should be cultivated, or is it at best anachronistic, at worst a dangerous practice? I will not attempt to give a general answer to these normative questions, for I do not think a compelling general answer can be given. Nation is used to do too wide a variety of work in too wide a range of contexts. However, Lawler details that if we attempt to interpret nations as agents, the real-world data belie the false assumption, as shown when shared moral standards justify wildly different behaviors. All Western states declared themselves to be motivated to varying degrees by humanitarian concerns. Nonetheless, they differed sometimes wildly, either between themselves or within their own publics, with regard to the content of their internationalism or its practical implications, especially the appropriateness of deploying deadly force in the name of humanitarian values. Key to this differentiation were overlapping disputes about such things as the legality of the resort to war, the need to secure formal UN approval, the credibility of the findings of the UN-appointed arms inspectors, and the merits of exhaustively pursuing other pathways to changing the internal and external conduct. So basically, the extensions there are, Lawler says, if in fact nations can share a moral status, why do they all behave so differently even when they do share a moral status? And Lawler B points out a more accurate explanation is the illocutionary one, that ontological claims involving national identity reflect the will of individuals and interest groups making those claims and not the agency of a fictional entity known as a nation. Lawler 2005A puts that out very clearly here. When communitarianism is applied to international politics, it can easily be read as merely an apologia for self-regarding statism and international moral relativism. Sovereign states remain the key actors in international politics since no decisive logic of global transformation can be discerned, even if the prevalence of chronic global inequity or horrific forms of large-scale violence generates widespread demands that something be done, be it by the international community or individual states. International public opinion carries little force. Little or no international community exists beyond rhetoric, and the idea of states acting in response primarily to moral dictates is usually tainted by egotistic self-interest. When states claim to be acting in a cosmopolitan-minded manner, realism suggests that this is more likely to reflect concerns about prestige or image or hard interests, which are convenient to subsume under the category humanitarian. Wow, that was a good case. I really killed it when I made that thing. A numerical fight. Well, here's the thing, John W. Is that the fact is we do have groups that act and take action as an agent. We call those things corporations. To incorporate is to take on the capacity to legally act as an individual, even though you're a group. So there are certainly contexts in which the group has legal authority to act and legal liability for their actions, civil liability especially. So if a corporation, for example, commits some sort of bad act that causes a lot of harm to the population, they are, as an entity, that corporation is liable, not any individual. That's why we have limited liability corporations. The point is, a nation state is not a corporation. It may be an incorporated state. I'm not sure if the United States is incorporated or not, but the thing is, we use that term even to discuss those things that get treated as though they were determinate. So, for example, any of the Bill of Rights that's been incorporated means it applies not just to the federal government, but to the states. That it exists now independently as an entity, rather than as a tool, as simply as a constraint on the federal government. So that's what it means. To incorporate means to take something that's larger than an individual or different from an individual and turn it into functionally an individual, treat it as though it were one. I mean, I agree with you, John W., that at the end of the day, one of the big problems that humanity has is that the capacity to cooperate to accomplish great things also has within it the capacity to disassemble a given action into a bunch of sub actions that each in and of itself doesn't have any normative status. So it becomes challenging then to determine exactly where and when a person's knowledge of a given action's ultimate impacts make that person culpable. So in other words, there is such a thing as conspiring, and there is such a thing as criminal conspiracy. If I'm part of a criminal conspiracy, a criminal organization that does a bunch of bad shit, it shouldn't be necessary to find me guilty of murder personally to acknowledge that I'm guilty of a larger crime than none, even though I was just a driver, right? So I'm a driver, but I know fully what's going on. All I'm doing is driving people to go kill people, and then they get back in the car, and I drive them to this other place to do other criminal things. I haven't done anything but drive, and yet I'm still guilty of being part of a criminal conspiracy, and that's fair, you know. Right. Well, that's the thing. I'm not saying that the Bill of Rights is the only reason I brought up the Bill of Rights is to point out that we use the term incorporation even when we take something like in the Bill of Rights that technically the Bill of Rights only constrains the federal government. It doesn't apply to the state governments. But some of the rights articulated in the Bill of Rights have been incorporated. What does that mean? It means they have they're extant beyond their role in constraining the federal government. And some of them haven't been incorporated. So it's like which ones haven't been incorporated? The third, there's no reason to incorporate the third. Answer your question above. is this self-sucking on the metaphysical field? I mean, it's what Sten says. It was the best way for me to address the question. I've already addressed it in great form there. Now, granted, that's dense. It's for TI people. It's not easy to understand, and I get it. It assumes you understand a lot going in. It's actually for debaters. It's an article I wrote that I never did anything with or anything, but basically it's my saying, hey, debate community, we need to start being a little bit more morally responsible here in our argumentation, because some bullshit's winning and shouldn't be winning. I'm here. You can scold. He's imagining his crowd, his class, his opponents now, just as he did then. That's very much tied to his type. I wasn't so much imagining it as I was just feeling the rightness of the words. Yes, this, yes. Finally, somebody's saying the right thing. Oh, that's me. Okay. Well, regardless, that's I'm not imagining I don't have to imagine an audience something to talk like I'm talking to an audience. I always talk like this. I don't really have an off. At the beginning of YouTube, when I first started doing YouTube, there was a clear distinction between on Eric, who's on camera, and off Eric. And somewhere along the line, it went away entirely. There's just no difference between me on camera and me off camera. That I can tell. Or, I don't feel any different. A lot of times I'll be talking, like when I'm making videos for uploading, I'm assuming that it's a live stream, and I remember, oh yeah, it's not a live stream. Well, the thing is, a counterexample does not negate every resolution, right? It depends how the resolution is phrased as to whether or not counterexamples are sufficient to negate. Okay, so let's talk about that resolution that said individuals in the United States should have compulsory national service of some kind. Within the debate community, everybody knows one way you're never going to win that argument on neg is say, well, here's an example of a person who shouldn't have to have national compulsory service, because they say we're talking about a general federal policy here. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions. We'll make exceptions for people who blah, 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 blah. That's fine. We're not being asked to universally apply this to every single individual. We're merely arguing that it's a good policy in general. And that's the end of that counterexample. So in other words, proof by example doesn't work in either direction. It doesn't work. Well, I mean, the thing is, they don't write such bad resolutions, right? Nobody would argue about such a bad resolution. Occasionally there's a terribly skewed resolution, but not that often. Hello? I get these weird Chinese telemarketing calls. I employed perspective semantics quite a bit there. What do you mean? I mean, the thing is, what I'm talking about here, when I'm talking about competition debate, there's no, I'm not giving you any interpretations or trying to make any arguments. I mean, I'm telling you what it is, how it is. I mean, it's like, this is not, I've coached all levels of debate, all forms of debate. So that's how it is. I mean, there's no interpretation here, right? I am making an argument in that thing that we ought to do debate a certain way, but my observations about well, that brings me back to the title, why Joe. I'm not scared of crazy. Crazy doesn't scare me. I made a joke the other day about a cool reality show would be get all the typology YouTubers who have any sort of size or significance. No, I don't presume to know other people's perspectives for them. I understand that many people don't understand what I'm saying, which is why I said that right off the bat when I finished reading it. Well, what I mean by scared of crazy, though, is this. I suggested a fun reality show would be get a bunch of YouTubers, Lijo, me, CS Joseph, DSP, Megan Lavoda, and then get like 1,000 or 500 or maybe 100 subscribers from each of their channels, okay? And then put them into like a wilderness capture the flag team thing kind of thing, and but then make the teams randomly. So, for example, my team might have like 40 people from Lijo's community, 30 from Megan Lavoda's, 20 from DSP's, and 5 from mine, and 5 from CS Joseph's. You know, every community gets 100 representatives, and then you mix them up randomly. So, well, what I ended up saying the other night, this is why this title comes about, is that sounds like so much fun, and then I joked, Ashdeep would probably shank me. The thing is, I'm not actually scared of crazy. So I've had a person from the internet that was definitely not invited. I had no idea they were showing up, just show up at my house randomly, Brittany. And it was fine. It's like, I mean, it wasn't fine. It's not okay. I told her, look, you can't do this, but I'm not worried about it. I'm not scared of crazy. I assume if anybody's in front of me, but that's not true, Stan. That's definitely not true. Like Ashadeep and Queen's Gambit, I have concern about. Yeah, sure, Cam. I have concern about their mental well-being, right? You know, it's like I have no problem going like pew pew pew, right, with somebody who's wrong. But if they're wrong because they're crazy, then I feel some more empathy for that, you know. No, I'm not talking about the typologist being crazy. I'm talking about some of the. Get Marty in there, you know. Yeah, get Marty in there too. I'm not scared of crazy. I'm not worried about like what Lijo asked me. How do you answer phone calls from whomever? I'm not scared to talk to anybody about anything. Well, what if they're right? Who, the crazy people? But that's a general rule I'm trying to hold back more, Stan, because I've grown some and I recognize just how impactful it can be to have somebody like me come around and say, your understanding of your own identity is bullshit. You know? Well, I mean, the thing is, I also have no problem being rude. And I also don't make up bullshit usually. So, okay, well, I don't really want to talk to you right now. I'll talk to you later. Bye. And just hang up. I just say it. I have increasingly begun just not bullshitting at all. When I don't want to work because I don't feel like working and I've got something scheduled with my client, if I'm serious enough about not feeling like working, I have to just call them. I'll call them and say, I'm just not feeling it right now. Can you? So I don't want to do it today. Sorry. Or like yesterday, I forgot I had an appointment with Chloe at 2:00. I made plans to go. Scooting with Cameron, and then I realized, like right shortly after I made the plans, oh shit, I got the thing at 2:00. But instead of canceling the plans, I called my client and said, I just made plans to go scooting with Cameron. So can we reschedule this or something? I forgot about it, and I made plans, and I remembered about it. I just told her the truth. It's amazing how effective that is in life. You just always tell people the truth. People go through life concerned that, somehow they're going to get in trouble in some way. And so they're trying to manage that with interfacing, and they're fast and loose with reality. I can't work today. I stayed up all night on speed. Is a perfectly acceptable thing to say. If it's the truth, it's much more acceptable than anything else. But how does app effectively go about proving that a counterexample is impossible? You don't have to prove that it's impossible. You just have to win the round. App has made a case. Neg's attempting to attack it. App defends. If app successfully defends, if app's we can't call it scooting with Cooter, Cam, because Cooter's the name of an ex-girlfriend. App makes a case. Neg tries to attack it. App defends. And if their case is still standing, enough of their case is still standing for them to win the round at the end of the round, they win the round. It used to be the case in policy debate that there were so-called stock issues, and that the app had to defend each of the stock issues against neg attacks. And if they failed to do so, then neg would win. When I debated back in high school, I won lots of rounds on neg just by attacking the funding planks of people's policy cases. Because back in the day, we had real policy cases with funding planks. The answer to the logic behind rear-ending possibility is it puts the onus on the right person. The onus should be on each individual to avoid an accident. A person who's stopped can't avoid an accident, so the onus has to be on the person who's moving. Yeah, John W. You sound like an NTP. Are you of age to probably too old to debate now, but I want to start it. Long wanted to start an adult debating league. That the thing is, who caused it, right? Well, if we don't make it the responsibility of the rear ender, then we have to use a standard, which is to say, how quickly should you have to slam on your brakes, or can you slam on your brakes without it being too quick? Additionally, we have to ignore the fact that they might be compelled to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting the person in front of them. So that's why we have that rule. Bye, Cameron. SITENETISI. All day long, dog. All day long. I never asked that question before. It's a good question, right? Because there's definitely an obvious logic to it, but I bet you most people couldn't provide it. I typed you as INFJ, the language is coming from. Well, you might very well be an INFJ. Or are you JAN? You know what I think of course, when I see the name JAN? That guy named John who wrote songs for Beverly Hills Cops in the 1980s. Yeah, so the most NI answer is correct onus. And that's the problem with the whole COVID thing, is there's an incorrect onus. And it sets a precedent that the onus is on everybody to assume they've got Ebola and will kill everybody they come into contact with. It's ridiculous. Put the onus where it belongs. People who want to avoid getting COVID can take as much precaution as they want. No. You're not allowed to get COVID. That's what, if they, instead of their stupid COVID policies, what they should have just said is there's a $100 fine for getting COVID. That would solve the problem better. That's what they should have done, because then it would have actually been honest, right? It would have been honest. It would have been like, we're going to make you pay for the fact that people get sick. Oh, yeah. Are you familiar with that guy named Jan, who was, you might be an INTP. If you understand all that stuff that I was, if you followed along, no problem with that thing I was reading, this arguments and frameworks and what they imply and so forth. If you understood what I was doing there, pretty clearly for most of it anyway, because some of it's pretty debate specific, but for most of it, then you're probably an INTP. But yeah, language is a bit of an issue with you. I wish I could figure out a better answer to that problem that I periodically face. I really love and appreciate the fact that a fair amount of Europeans seem to watch my channel, and that's very gratifying. But I don't feel as though I can do them as good a service as a typologist as I can Americans. It may just be unavoidable limitation of being something and not other things. It's like, I don't know what German FE looks like. I don't know what Swedish FE looks like. I can't hear the cadence of that Japanese INTJ sounding like an INTJ, Isaiah. Are you rude? In this instance, yes, Den. Usually no, but that's because almost nothing is interesting enough and difficult enough to require all the INTP's attention. That is. Well, Sky Gear, I'm going to say that that we're better off not including this consideration of changing parental authority, and just continue functioning, apply the normal standards here, which is that the children are subsumed by their parents' autonomy. Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, John, I think you are an INFJ. The way our conversation went, the ease of it, the pacing of it, it felt like I was talking to an INFJ. That's not a good reason to type you as something, but I just, because I'm limited somewhat in my ability to, when I lose certain tools that I rely on heavily, language stuff, I guess it's worth mentioning that it felt like I was hanging out with an INFJ, which is great. I love hanging out with INFJs. They're great. But yeah, then again, I think to myself, but maybe that's just European coolness or something, right? Because Europeans tend to be more chill than Americans in general. Don't you think? Yeah. You know what, John? I should have said. I should have told you the same thing I tell most people when they say don't record it. Say, now look, I can record it and just share with you privately. Most people who tell me not to record it regret it after the fact. I should have said that to you because I normally do say that when somebody says that. But you seemed very sure. Like you didn't say like, well, it's like you knew coming in, no. So I didn't bother, you know. Okay, so let's talk about this roommate in a college dorm. One of the roommates is super panicky about COVID. One of them is super uncaring about it. The first thing I would say is those two should have a conversation because the person who's super scared about it has expectations to the one who's not scared for the one who's not scared. The one who's super scared about it expects the other person to behave differently than they normally do. So they need to have a conversation about that. And that conversation needs to include things like, well, okay, how likely am I to get it if I don't do Mia? How likely are you to get it if you do Mia, even if I have it? Now, granted, the rules change once it becomes clear that somebody has it, all right? Because then the justification matrix changes. If you definitely have it, then society placing certain demands on you to stay isolated and prevent yourself from giving it to other people, it's harder to argue against. But for people who don't have it and don't have any reason to believe they do have it, okay, well, so Skyer, if the person, let's say they don't make any compromise, there's no compromise there, and Joe goes out in the world, left and right, no mask, nothing, ends up contracting COVID, has it, comes home, doesn't show for 2 weeks, then gets it. Thing is, the other person who's super panicky about COVID needs to have taken the measures to preclude themselves from getting it, regardless of whether their roommate has it. That's certainly possible. So, in other words, the person can wear multiple masks themselves. They could even get a diving helmet. Of course, it's true that some people will not have the resources or means to move or control their environment and so forth. And it is true that there are some circumstances in which person A and person B are living together and disagree about COVID. But the assumption is that if I get COVID, you're going to get it if we live together. My point is, I mean, if you're so panicked about COVID, why haven't you taken precautions to prevent me from giving it to you regardless of whether I have it? Howdy.
Hi. Can we do 7 today?
7 o'clock today. Let me look at my calendar.
Okay.
7 o'clock. You got it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Are we doing Macbeth?
No, actually, they're doing the thinking paper. So basically, thinking paper just you write whatever you feel like. Finally.
Wait. Hold on. So this horrible woman, okay, she's assigned something she calls a thinking paper. And in the thinking paper, your job is to just say what you feel.
Yeah, I mean, she gives you like a whole bunch of topic, like feminism versus I forgot what, and then leadership versus tyranny, and a whole bunch of things. So
is she going to really allow him to write an actual paper? Are you going to allow us to write a paper?
I don't know. So basically, so
She asked for
I
it.
was hoping Jeffrey would find something else, but then Jeffrey said, "I want to write about leadership." And
She
tyranny."
asked
I'm like,
for
my
it.
God.
She asked for it. She's saying, "Here's your chance."
I don't know. I mean, this is a way of she wants the students to be able to write fast.
She is
Now, of course,
she
you
is
got
pitching a
Jeffrey on the
softball.
side.
She is pitching a softball right to the middle of the plate, and I want Jeffrey to hit that thing square, smack into her face, so hard that it takes her head off.
I mean, I don't think she's a terrible person. It's just that, you know, I mean, when you're
She might be a wonderful person. I'm not saying she's a terrible person. She's a horrible teacher, and since teaching has an obligation to not just not violate rights, but also to do some good for the students, in that regard, she's being immoral by failing to uphold that duty.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I see your point. Except I just don't think she's a terrible person. That's all.
I don't think she's a terrible person either. She just shouldn't be teaching English.
Yeah, she's not very right.
She should be. She should have a homeless dance troupe that does interpretive dance that she works with, so she can feel good all the time about her earnest goodness or something. I don't know.
Yeah, but yeah, so we might have another, you know, because Jeffrey chose leadership and tyranny. Like, oh.
Okay, so I mean, I hope he hammers her. You know, not directly. Don't.
Not directly.
Right, not directly, but I think we should definitely hammer educational leadership in schools specifically.
Well, no, he's doing the like very political, like 1984 and the Animal Farm.
Wait. Why are we involving books in this?
I don't know. It's basically whatever you want to write about.
But it has to involve a book?
It doesn't.
So why is he involving Animal Farm in 1984?
Because it's just whatever you want to talk about. So
all right, well, I need to talk to him then. We need to talk. We'll talk tonight, okay?
Okay.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Bye. Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Finally. I hate this English teacher. I don't think she's a horrible person, but she doesn't want. She's got bad aesthetics, and she's teaching the students to have bad aesthetics. She's got bad ways of justifying things and thinking about things, and is trying to teach the students to have the same bad ways of thinking about things and justifying things. And she moves the goalposts, which is totally unacceptable for a teacher. Yeah, Amanda May. The time and the place to battle is from the first day of class until the last day of class. Or until you make the teacher retire early, whichever comes first. Amanda May, that's the problem I have with Jeffrey's mom. That's the strategy she wants to use. My strategy is, why be the supplicant? Make them be the supplicant. Make them scared to give you anything but an A. I don't want to fuck with that guy. A. Easy squeezy. That guy argues about everything, complains about everything, and is quite good at it. The last thing I want to do is give him a B. The morale person? Do you mean moral or morale? I know who Jonathan Haidt is, I think. He's a typology community person. I have an image of his face in my mind, but I have no idea what he says or anything. No, well, I mean, I think Jeffrey's mom is reluctantly telling me the truth that the teacher's giving Jeffrey his chance. In other words, oh, he's all about morals? I mean, my wife asked me, "Are you having sex behind my back?" I said, "Who else do you think it was? Who is not a typology guy? Who's a professor? Jonathan Haidt?" I mean, the thing is this. I mean, you can't just tell them they're an idiot. Yeah, you can't just insult them or whatever. You have to I mean, it always begins with questions, right? It always begins with questions. And then it proceeds like this. But hold on. You answered question A, meow, and question B, meow. So how am I supposed to possibly have the right answer for C since it violates one of those two? And they go, you know what? That's how you do it. You don't insult them. You go, I just do not get this. How is your expertise any use at all if you can't answer my questions about the subject matter you're supposedly an expert on? That's so backwards, John W., what he's doing there. There is no difference between values. The differences between people's values shouldn't be described like that. They should be described as functions of their attentional priorities. So it's like I'm what you call a post-principalist, which is to say a properly built pragmatarian. An improperly built pragmatarian starts out pragmatic. A properly built pragmatician starts out as a principalist and grows to understand that just as the world is too complex for people's stupid heuristics to predict outcomes meaningfully in, so too is the world too complex for any set of dogma to be totalizing, including my principles. So that's called meta-rationalism, and it requires some faith-based or magical frame of thinking as well. You can't do it successfully without a magical thinking frame, because if you try to do it without a magical thinking frame, then you are being wrong about your own rationalism. And that's never okay. It's just like I'd like to read a few wonderful quotes from Richard Feynman. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Which I love. He also said this: if I could explain it to the average person, I wouldn't have been worth the Nobel Prize. Also, he said this. What a great ENTP. What I cannot create, I do not understand. What a great guy. And this brilliant quote: I don't know what's the matter with people. They don't learn by understanding. They learn by some other way, by rote or something. Their knowledge is so fragile. Isn't that fantastic? I love it. And this is his advice to young people. Fall in love with some activity and do it. Nobody ever figures out what life's all about, and it doesn't matter. Explore the world. Nearly everything is really interesting if you go into it deeply enough. Work as hard and as much as you want to on the things you like to do the best. Don't think about what you want to be, but what you want to do. keep up some kind of a minimum with the other things so society doesn't stop you from doing what you want. That's the best advice I've ever heard. That is the best advice I've ever heard. I don't know enough about Tyler, the Creator. That's Richard Feynman, one of the hero ENTPs of history. Now, principles are TI matters. Authentic sympathy, empathy, and stuff, those are FI matters. Those are not principles. See, FI is what says somebody breaks into my house and is rummaging through my shit and stealing stuff. I've got a gun and I just shoot him. And my answer is, you know what? Principles are all well and good, but you come in and put my family at risk, threaten my family. This is where I draw the line. I was justified. Counts as self-defense. I shot that fucker. I don't even feel bad about it. That's FI. TI says, I don't see any weapon on this person at all. I'm not just going to shoot him in the back. I have to have more justification than that. Even though I'm scared and I'm really, really angry that this person's invaded my family's space. I'm TI second slot. I mean, the thing is, morals, values, principles, they come from the deliberation functions, probably is a good way to put it. There's no doubt that ultimately I have FI as an absolute value and TI as an instrumental value because I'm probably the first guy, not the second guy. You know, in that story about the home being invaded by a ski masked robber who's rummaging through your shit, stealing stuff. I mean, I'd probably try to use non-lethal force. But I'd probably hit him over the head with a baseball bat or something like that, which might kill him. And when I thought about it later, I would say, I don't feel like I really have any more responsibility there because I was forced to be an object of SE. Don't make me an object of SE. I don't want to be the object of your SE. You know? 8 slot. Eric, are ESFJs the INTP's supervisor? No, they're their dual. If the dominant function is the primary attentional domain and the opposite function is a mutually exclusive domain, it would seem to follow the 8th slot. No, the opposite is not mutually exclusive. No. It's not the case that NE and NI are mutually exclusive. Mutual exclusivity really only occurs with things on the same axis. So it has to be on the same axis. And it's, yeah, I know my 8th slot is SE. No, they're not. They're absolutely not exclusive. Things on the same axis have a quality of exclusivity. Okay? So, for example, NE and SI have a quality of exclusivity to them because if I'm spewing a bunch of ideas, those hours that I'm doing that I'm not organizing the ideas that I'm spewing. So most of this has been NE. When I was reading my previous writings, that's SI. Right? When I was reading what I had written previously, I wasn't making up something new. Auxiliary FI cause a barricade on TI? I don't know what you mean by that. If you've got FI fourth, you've got TI fifth. Oh, tool determines polar. Oh, well, that's because FI and TI are not generally necessarily in disagreement with each other. It's just that TI is it evaluates things wait, so it's like this. TI says, assuming no FI, what? FI says, what? Now, assuming no FI, what? What? Oh, we're in agreement. Okay? Often enough. Assuming no FI, yeah, what? Okay, now we have a problem. Let's check to make sure you assumed no FI first. What do you mean? I don't even understand that question. What? So the problem is, since it's a tool function, even though an FI person might be mostly in agreement with me, my tool function is what I use when there is something I have to deal with, right? So it's not like right now I'm having to answer this question. So I'm using my tool function. When I'm disagreeing with you and you're using FI, then I'm using my tool function still. And I'm saying, okay, so given that we are not talking, given that we get rid of FI considerations, but the other person's not going to do that. They're not going to play, let's get rid of FI considerations. So that's what makes it polar, is that everybody can assume, let's get rid of FI considerations to some extent. And everybody can, to some extent, say, let's consider FI considerations. But if it's your tool function, you're constantly, every time you have to do something in the world, you're getting rid of those interested considerations as a means of legitimizing something. And your tool function is a legitimizing tool function, a deliberation function. Then that's going to mean you're blind to the other kind of deliberation. You only have, you know, the Sky Gear is going to help me with this at some point, okay? Which is, you have a certain number of agent, subject, object cards to play. And they go with the slots. First slot gets all three, agent, subject, object. The second slot gets probably all three as well. I'm not sure. Okay, good, Rain. Thank you. So if we think about it like that, I know from my experience, FI for me, I'm object only. I experience it as an object. I'm like, something makes me sad or makes me cry or makes me happy or makes me laugh or whatever. I'm not really receiving it in the sense that I'm not observing, making observations about the matter. I'm just experiencing it. So I know that for me anyway, 7th slot, I only get the object card put there. But that may be a function of what kind of function it is too. So like agent, subject, object card for NE as a DOM, fine. But NE as 7th, would it only be subject since it's basically a subject function? And is the reason why my FI only object because FI is basically an object function? I don't know the answer to that question. So if all the TI people around can help me figure this out, it's greatly appreciated. Talking out with you right here is helping a lot, you know? It really is. So I don't really know things that I know until I say them out loud. Okay, I'm going to call it a stream. It's almost 3 hours. Thanks for being here. I love you with my heart, and I love you with my spleen. I love it when you make some art being super mean.